now for over a decade. I've gone from being a developer at a very, very poor level to sort of agile leader, so Scrum Master, project manager, over the years, and turned into a trainer and a coach, to the point where now I've formed the company Agile Snap a few years ago, focusing on agile training and coaching. I'm also one of the co-organizers of the Southwest Agile Group, so would love to see some of you there. And I like to think of myself as being quite a pragmatic person. And that was kind of the reason behind this talk, really, is that, you know, taking my career down the route of working with different agile teams, I noticed a lot of patterns that were happening, and people were treating agile like any other process, really, and they were becoming very stubborn in work in that particular way. And regardless of what process teams use, they often became very confined by that process. So if they were a Scrum team, for example, they were very sort of religious about making sure that they did things the right way according to Scrum. And the more I saw of them, I didn't like what I saw going on, and I wanted to take things right back to the agile roots of what it means to be agile, you know, how we want to empower teams and individuals to do a good job, and really get rid of that sense of entitlement that I often see with brand new agile teams who might have just been trained or received Scrum Master training, whatever it might be. There's that very kind of tunnel view that people have, where, you know, they want to be agile, but actually what's at the end of the tunnel is normally something like a certification. You often find it's Certified Scrum Master. That's generally the kind of default that people look towards. And yeah, I'm really trying to shake that kind of that entitlement feeling that people have about a certain flavor of agile. Nevertheless, agile is a really great thing. It's good that we actually care about how we deliver software these days. Obviously, agile delivery is only a thing because the way we used to deliver software just never used to work. And, you know, genuinely, I do believe that if you use agile correctly, there is no better way to deliver software. But as I say, I think we've got a little lost recently, and from what I see when I work with organizations now at a transition level, there's a desire to pick a certain agile framework from day one. There's no idea of, you know, where are we today? How can we improve our process and get better? There's this idea that we've looked at Scrum, or we've looked at Kanban, or we've looked at the SDM, and that's what we want to do. So we're going to scrap what we have and immediately start trying to work this way without any sort of pragmatism. And you end up with this kind of precious feeling towards a particular, this is a picture of an actual Scrum Master who's just been certified. But people do get they're so precious about a particular framework that they will do anything that Scrum, the textbook, tells them to do, and often don't look outside of the box. And that became a problem. And this is an activity I sometimes do when I run this talk a bit longer. We won't do it today, where I ask some agile teams in front of me to look at these three kind of marketing descriptions, if you like, for a particular framework that exists, or different frameworks that exist right now. And if we look at these, you know, focus on business justification and satisfaction, dividing the project into manageable stages, a flexible approach, all these things, they sound really good on the face of it. But actually, what you will learn is that each of these is just part of Prince 2. And obviously, we talk about Prince 2 as the real kind of the anti-way to deliver software these days. But it just goes to show that there's, you know, any process that exists, there are certain parts of it that you can take and might work really well for you, depending on you know, on what sort of delivery you're working in. And I'm certainly not here to advocate Prince 2 to any of you, in the same way that I'm not here to evangelize a particular agile framework. But what I am here to do is to kind of tell you guys that, you know, we shouldn't be trying to make our bed at the very beginning of a project when it comes down to a process. And we really should go back to what the Agile Manifesto tells us, and really trust the people and how they interact with each other to get a job done. You know, processes can be good, and sometimes we have to take processes to safeguard us from certain things. But we should never be putting ourselves in a position where a process is the only way in which we can get from A to B, is to follow the exact process that takes us there. We want to take an agile approach that means we know what A looks like and we know what B looks like, but actually how we get there will depend on the interactions that we have throughout the project. So going back to pragmatism, what does it actually mean? And it's all about dealing with things sensibly, realistically, but importantly, it's about using practical rather than theoretical considerations. Now, a lot of process, whether it's agile processes or waterfall processes or something in between, they are firmly based on theoretical considerations. Whereas agile at its very heart is around using these practical considerations and trying something out with very short feedback loops. And if something works, great, we'll keep doing it or doing it slightly better. Or if something isn't working, we'll stop doing it or maybe start doing something else in its place. And so we still have to be pragmatic around any approach that we take and understand that what might work today for something might not work tomorrow for something else. So yeah, we're all about that kind of practicality of something rather than the theoretical. So, coming up with a solution that fits the problem, you might start with a process that says if this particular thing occurs, then this is the process we have for it. But don't be afraid to abandon that process if it doesn't work. And again, it's something I see a lot, especially with Scrum teams specifically. If the process says that we have to do a stand-up every morning, then let's do a stand-up every morning, even if we're not getting any value out of it. And it's important that we as experienced people, as professionals, can use that experience to find a new solution. So remembering what worked for next time, but similarly, don't enforce yourselves on having a process that captures everything, because as we've seen time and time again, sometimes you can document a process that gets you out of a pickle one time, but if you keep trying to reapply that process, it doesn't always work. And this is what we're saying about having a practical rather than a theoretical consideration. Don't always rely on a process to tell you what to do in a certain scenario. So in this example, the process tells us if we have a vehicle that's been somehow ended up in a dock, then we bring a crane out and we lift that vehicle out. But what happens when the process fails us? So once again, now we're in a situation where we have a vehicle in a dock. So the process tells us to go and get a crane to get that vehicle out. But we can get the first vehicle out, that's fine, the process has worked. We'll try it again for the second process, the second vehicle, but then we have a similar repeat here. So the process tells us to get another crane and we'll do exactly the same thing. And obviously this is a very tongue-in-cheek example, but we see it time and time again where we have a process and we just keep blindly following it because that's what we've been told is the way to do things. Another famous quote, and we hear this every day as well, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. And whilst that is sound advice in general, we tend to take it too literally. When we're talking about process in the way that we do things, we do generally have this kind of feeling around in the dark, following a process blindly because that's what the textbook tells us to. And again, without fear of repeating myself, I'm not here, this is not all about waterfall processes to say waterfall processes are bad because they're very prescribed. But it's the same thing with agile processes and agile textbook frameworks like Scrum. And I do pick on Scrum a lot. And it's not because I don't like Scrum. I actually really do like Scrum. But one of the slides we'll come on to in a second is that a lot of people adopt Scrum without any real justification for it. And Scrum is one of those things that if you can make Scrum work, if you give it the right environment to work, it works really well. But if you try and shoehorn Scrum into an environment that just isn't very accommodating for Scrum, then you do generally see a lot of issues with it. And that's where we'll see a lot of these failed agile transitions, not so much because Scrum has failed you, but because you've tried to introduce a square peg into a round hole. So a lot of this stuff sounds like common sense. And like most things agile, it is. We're trying to say here that if you try something, we want to reduce that cost of failure, which again is what agile is all about. And if it fails, try something else and don't be afraid to do that. That's pretty standard. A lot of agile teams are good at that because we're reducing the size of those feedback loops. We're allowing people to make mistakes and be comfortable with failure. But don't continue to do the same thing over and over again just because that process tells you to do so. And as I said, that can be as low level as something technical that we have a process for and we keep following this release process because that's what our release process tells us to do, even if nobody actually believes that's the best way to release bundles or whatever it might be. but something like we said with the standard, if the standard's not working for us, then let's not keep doing it just for habit's sake, because that's what the process tells us. Again, use your experience as professionals, and I use this a lot when I'm working with development teams. We've had a very bad we've been very bad in this industry at sort of babying development teams. For some reason, we don't treat development teams like experienced professionals with a certain skill that not everyone can do. We've always sort of treated development teams like school kids effectively, and we've micromanaged them. We need to rely on their experience as professionals to make those sort of decisions. And as we said, fail early and adapt. It's a really key giving people that safe space to be able to do that and feel like they can do that. So being pragmatic is easier than you think, and in general it does start with leadership. I often see two different types of leaders. You've got pragmatic leaders and you've got idealist leaders. You've got pragmatic leaders who are happy to kind of focus on the let's get something done, taking each step at a time, being very realistic, which can often be construed as being negative, versus your idealist leadership, which is kind of focusing on the grand vision and not so much on what we're doing now, focusing on the end game rather than the kind of the journey. These are the type of people with the rose-tinted glasses who have just been on their certified Scrum Master course, for example, and they want to take all the stuff they've learned from that course and really drive it home into the project team they've got. They've got this vision of becoming Scrum, whatever that might be, and how they get there, it's almost like a bulldozer getting through everything. And as I said, you generally have a lot of issues when you try and implement that approach. And if the leadership isn't right, then it often affects the culture. And this is a real big problem within Agile transitions. If we don't have this pragmatic approach, if we go in heavy-handed and sort of say, this is Scrum, this is how we want to do things, let's completely disregard the decades worth of legacy process that exists in this business, you're immediately creating this toxic culture of people that think they know better, for lack of a better term. And there's got to be that respect between the company culture, the team culture, and understanding that everyone wants to do things a bit better. We want to avoid that kind of them and us mentality. And I feel like a lot of processes, they read to you in a way that suggests that everything you've done up until this point has been wrong. So let's stop doing all that, and now let's do all this new fancy stuff that we've found out about from these training courses or whatever it might be. So we really need to be talking around starting very small, starting with where we are today and building that up. So I just wanted to tie a lot of this pragmatism back to the Agile Manifesto, and for those who don't know the Agile Manifesto, you get a real quick lesson here. But remembering that practical rather than theoretical considerations is what we're fundamentally talking about. And the first part of the manifesto is around people and interactions and how we value those more than processes and tools. And as I said, as an Agile coach, as someone who's been an Agile practitioner all my life, it's really easy for me to sit here and say, well, I just want to get rid of any sort of waterfall process because that's bad, and that's generally the message you get from Agile teams, and especially from Agile coaches and Scrum Masters and whoever you might be. If you're involved in that Agile circle, you're often very kind of negative and tunnel vision around the process that you prescribe. But I'm actually here to say, well, let's burn everything. Let's get rid of this idea we've got all these fantastic different processes and you have to pick one of these magical things from a shelf and implement it in your environment. In actual fact, I don't want to burn anything. What I do want to say is use the best of everything. Be open-minded to what's out there. The very best Agile practitioners, just like the very best technical engineers, are framework agnostic. Understanding what's out there and the different approaches that you can adapt really do help you become a more rounded Agile practitioner. So never be precious around a particular framework. The grass is sometimes greener outside, even if we don't necessarily want to admit it. But if we don't want to admit that, it's generally because we are quite precious about something. Myself personally, I'm Prince 2 qualified. I've done ITIL. I've done all sorts of stuff, not because I necessarily believe in it, but I like to see what else is out there, just to sort of reaffirm my beliefs that Agile is the best way of doing things. And you need to do that, to have that outside the box thinking. And if something works for you, great. Don't be afraid to keep doing something if something works. And similarly, don't be afraid to stop doing something if it doesn't work. So yeah, the stand-up is one that we talked about earlier on. It becomes very mundane, the same thing every day. We've probably all been in a stand-up like this, where we're asking the same 3 questions or talking about the same three things every day, when really if we're not talking, we're just thinking about something completely different. It's just one example of something you don't have to do by the book because the book tells you to do it that way. It's actually one of the things that people tell me, well, we're Agile because we do stand-ups, and actually that's just a very small part of the puzzle, and they don't even have to do stand-ups to be thought of as Agile. Another lesson that people often don't understand is that Agile is more than just Scrum. Scrum is very popular, but it is just one of the many different frameworks that sit under this Agile umbrella. I'm not ashamed to admit, when I first got introduced to Agile 12 years ago, I just thought Scrum was it. I thought the 2 words were interchangeable and that was what it was all about. But there are many different types of frameworks, and as I said, it's a good practitioner is very open-minded to everything else that's out there. Some of these frameworks are far more verbose than others by design. Not to say that I prefer ones over the others, but there's generally a time and a place to use each of them. I'm not going to go into this too much today, but Scrum is still by far the most popular. Around 70% of all implementations are using Scrum. I personally don't believe that those 70% are using Scrum because it's the right approach for them. I just think Scrum is the most popular because of various marketing and training and so forth. But the 8% custom hybrid is the interesting thing there, and I want to see that grow because I want to get away from this idea that we have to do everything a particular framework tells us to do or nothing, otherwise we can't do it, and really find out how we can find a process that works for us. So I have to rush through a bit of these because we want to get through everything. So I'm all about starting with Agile first rather than Scrum or any other framework. Consider your existing process. Be pragmatic about where you are today. You can only go forward if you know where you are right now. Don't just try and abandon everything and insist on picking a particular way of working straight away. We don't want this Pied Piper approach where you as a Scrum Master or Scrum evangelist, practitioner, whatever you want to call yourself, are getting people to follow you blindly without any real insight as to why Scrum has been chosen or any other methodology for that matter. We really want people to understand where our barriers are right now. The second part of the manifesto is all about delivering working software, which is more important than comprehensive documentation. The nutshell around all this is that whilst that is still true, working software is fantastic and it is a great way of working iteratively to show that things are working, keep those feedback loops really concise so that we can adapt the product moving forward. It's about knowing your audience. If you've got a boss who, or someone on an MD level who, they're interested in bottom line stuff, going up and saying, yeah, can you spare an hour of your time to come and see all the stuff at real low level that we actually want to show you that we did in the last sprint, isn't something that's going to particularly wash well. So having that pragmatic approach and understanding where you can show working software versus where you might need to rely on some sort of documentation is important, and it's about finding that kind of happy medium. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. The kind of thought here is that you need a blank check to work this way. You need to be able to, work on something until it's finished or until it's deemed finished. And again, in reality, what we're trying to do here is find the middle ground. And the customer has obviously got a right to expect something for their money, but project teams also shouldn't be expected to commit to this big bang delivery. So we need to find a solution somewhere in the middle. And the old iron triangle with time, cost, and quality being fixed with scope as the variable in the middle is the important kind of measure that we're looking to do. We need to have that flexibility on the scope, because rather than agreeing to these big milestones, we want to agree to these small milestones so we can continuously deliver software at smaller increments rather than doing it in one big bang, and that it gives us a much more shared responsibility and sort of risk management to a project. And to do that, we have to be pragmatic about how we estimate. And I'm sure there's lots of people rolling their eyes now, oh, it's a delivery person talking about how we should be estimating. But I do genuinely believe that, estimation is a skill, And we shouldn't be afraid of doing it. And actually, I personally think that the reason we've been pushing back on estimation so much is not because we can't estimate, but because people are so focused on treating our estimates as deadlines that, you know, it's become that feared thing. Whereas I think you should be able to estimate at any level of a project. It's just making sure you are using the correct measure and the correct scale to do that. And we're not going to go into any of these in massive amounts of detail today. But estimation is always valuable. Even at the highest level, just knowing if a project is something like 10 grand or £1 million, that's important to know early on, because you might not have a budget to even progress with the project. So being comfortable and pragmatic with estimation is equally important. So just to start wrapping this up, we need to think about how we take pragmatism beyond the manifesto. We need to be aware of having that tunnel vision within any process that we actually work in. And we have to be not afraid to break the rules. And if we're in a leadership role, we have to put people in an environment where they feel like they can break the rules because cost of failure is so dramatically reduced. Don't lose faith. These things do take a long time, but being pragmatic about it will help you focus on the journey more than the goal. And finally, it's all about picking your battles. If you are looking to transition to Agile, there are some textbook things that work really well and some that take a long time to get there. And as we saw earlier on, it's no good just going to your managing board and saying, oh, we want to show you all the stuff we've done, if they don't necessarily have an interest in that right now. If you've got to play the game a little bit and still work towards your old process, still produce some documentation, then you might have to do that for a while. But the job here is it's about the journey, as we said, and how we can, over time, convince people that there is a better way to work. But to do that, we shouldn't just abandon everything we've done before and forget about it. We have to be pragmatic about that approach. And the real final bit here is around the hidden stuff that we don't talk about within Agile, because we like to make it feel like this blue sky, bird singing, or, you know, miraculous turnaround silver bullet. You know, Agile is going to cost a lot of money if you want to transition to it. It will be extremely disruptive to the organization. You probably won't see any return on investment for a while, but small changes will make a difference. You don't have to take a big bang approach to adopting Agile. I'll tell you now, you probably cannot use a single framework by the book. In the decade I've been working Agile projects, I've only ever worked in one pure Scrum implementation, for example. And that is exactly why we have to be pragmatic in everything that we do. So that's me today. Sorry to rush through some of it. As I said, if any of you are interested in Agile, please come along to the South Wales Agile group. We meet on the 4th Thursday of every month in Cardiff. And if you have any questions, don't have time to ask them now, please feel free to drop them to me on Twitter. My business account is @AgileSnap. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk.